the reality about compliance, if you get it wrong, it can be very, very expensive indeed.
Regulations are always changing. It's almost like a bit of a minefield out there, isn't it?
I think I had about 12 interns. 8 of them went on to senior positions.
How do you see the future of compliance training?
Compliance is the sixth sense of the organisation.
I'm about to sit down with Bill Howarth, the man of compliance himself, who took an idea into a global enterprise that is now the world's largest compliance association, training millions of students in over 120 different countries. We'll be taking 25 years of that education and compliance knowledge into one conversation. Take away all the things that you need to from this conversation and implement them in your compliance career or your business today. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get stuck in. Bill, thanks for your time. Look, I know who you are. Obviously, you're part of the team here now at Study Academy, and I'm sure there's plenty of people watching in the compliance world that know who you are as well. But for those that don't, please tell us a little bit about yourself and obviously a bit about the business you co-founded and scaled over the years.
Thanks very much, John. I think the first thing to say is that the whole of my professional career has been in the education and training arena. I started from a legal background and taught for the first 25 years of my career in a number of universities around the world in the areas of law and regulation and areas allied to that. I spent 10 years at the University of Hong Kong, and when on coming back to the United Kingdom, I decided to go into professional education. So having been in university and academic education, I moved into professional education, and I joined an organization called Central Law Training International, who had programs and courses and wanted them developing into accredited learning in the field of wealth management. And so one of the very first projects that I did was to create the framework of education for a professional body called STEP, the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners. And the qualifications and diplomas and things that we built there were taken up all over the world in many, many countries, and are still a very successful set of qualifications today. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I decided to move into a new area. It was an area I didn't know very much about. It was the area of compliance. It was a fairly new discipline. And I'm going back, well over 25 years now. But at the time, there was an opportunity. There was very little training, if any, in that particular field. And therefore, there was no awarding bodies and no organizations to do it. So the decision was made to set up a new professional body and provide proper education and training. Now, that I did, and we created the International Compliance Association. Now, the very clever thing that we did at the time, didn't particularly realize it at the time, was say, well, nobody's going to know who it's a new body. Why would people want to join that as a body and do their training? We linked in with the University of Manchester Business School, where I'd had, I was a student previously and I'd worked there as a partner, and also the British Bankers Association, who had all their banks who needed training in this new area of compliance. So from day one, you had the ICA in association with the University of Manchester and the British Bankers Association, bringing in new certifications and qualifications that everybody certainly in the financial services industry needed at the time. And we developed it from there. Now, that then went on to become the largest compliance association in the world over a period of 20 years. And during that period, so not only was I one of the founders, I was also the CEO and president for 25 years, up to the end of last year, until, of course, I've joined Study Academy now.
And you mentioned there that partnership with the university and the British Bankers Association. Do you think that was a pivotal point in the business journey that really, it was almost like a launch pad, do you think, for
absolutely it was an absolute gem of an idea to do it. It was the right time, and it was done in the right way, because It guaranteed quality.
And credibility as well.
Credibility,
Yeah,
quality. The content was good. The badging was great. An established university. All the banks needed the training. All together then. So it was a recipe for success, as it was, and has been for, ever since.
And you can see why that was, a relatively new firm, I suppose, back then. And what is essentially, you say there, not many people knew about compliance. It was this new sort of subject
Absolutely.
topic area in a way. To have that backing, I suppose, and that credibility would have been a huge help for
massive.
And when you say, I know you said there that that it then became a global firm, right? So if you had to sort of quantify that for those that, I'm sure a lot of people know the ICAR, but if they don't, how many learners over how many countries do you think?
I mean, in terms of pure learners, they probably trained over 1 million people. Including, a significant number of those in the financial services industry, in more than 120 countries around the world. So, a massive, they did a fantastic job over the years. There's no question about that.
Well, over 1 million learners, 120 odd countries, over 25 years. I'm sure that wasn't, I've had this idea, which nobody sort of really knows about, this compliance thing. And it was this really smooth sailing process of 25 years. I'm sure there was some horrendous,
no, it wasn't.
Really big hurdles and some challenges along the way.
But the thing is, when you're building something and you've got the adrenaline and you've got, sort of things that are going well behind you, it's easy. But the thing is, building an international organization is really, really difficult.
And that's what I wanted to ask. What do you think was the biggest challenge of building that? What was the biggest hurdles that you found?
When we designed the programs, we used international principles as the core of the diplomas in anti-money laundering and compliance. But the problem is, laws and regulations in different parts of the world are different. And also the language of delivery is different. So how do you then go? Well, we've got a great product. And the key thing is, I visited almost all these jurisdictions, wherever we set up a new centre. First thing I always did was visit the regulator. If you can get the regulators on board and the education authorities, which is what we did, it was always welcomed. So that was the starting point. Now, we usually employed local trainers as well as our international ones. So to give the local slant on the laws and regulations, we put the local content into the programs on the back of the international principles. So they were getting international and local content into their programs. They were having we had great materials. We appointed really strong people who delivered in the language. Everybody had to be, in the main, have both languages, both English and the international language. We translated in some areas materials. It was more difficult in the early days than it is now, which is much easier. But the key thing there was buying into and being in partnership with the regulators and the authorities in those jurisdictions, making sure the content was great, delivered in the local language and in accordance with the laws and regulations of those jurisdictions.
So I suppose what you guys essentially did there was taken essentially what is a challenge was that the multiple regulations in all the different areas, and actually turned it into a positive for the business of
Absolutely.
We're going to implement people on the ground. Bill jet setting, constantly living on planes and hotels.
What I was saying is lived on aeroplanes for many, many years.
But I suppose you've taken that, haven't you? And then utilised that. So almost looking at that as a key aspect of turning that challenge into a positive that ultimately helped, I suppose, the ICA expand even further into multiple countries there.
I mean, it's a wonderful organisation. But you'd say, well, you would say that you built it. I don't work there anymore, but it's still a wonderful organisation, and it's done a fantastic service to the compliance industry over the years.
And I think something that really stands out, and it stands out for two reasons, is the accreditation and that sort of endorsement and things from the University of Manchester and the British Bankers Association. And I suppose here at Study Academy, you're now part of the team as our Director of Education and Training. But it's almost like we didn't know about that, but
but you've done something similar.
Yeah, so we're now partnered and we're endorsed by a university and we're CPD UK accredited and we're obviously a approved supplier of training.
And that's the right thing to do
to the MOD and stuff. So it's I agree. I think with, especially in the world of compliance, obviously we do training not just in compliance in various different sectors, but for us it really helped having the credibility of, you know, organizations knowing that we're backed by a university, and that we have that quality assurance element there, and even more so with yourself now, you know, that's a key part of what you do with us is making sure the content is up to the level it should be. So there's some, it's almost some sort of, it's quite nice to hear there's some key elements of the ICA that
people will say to me, well, if in fact the ICA was that great, why are you not there now? Well, the answer is because I retired. But retirement didn't suit me, so I've had to try and come back now. You know, and
for those people who don't know, Bill is a very, very good table tennis player, and there's only so much table tennis that you could do, and then
that's exactly right.
And I always say that I think deep down it's because you're an entrepreneur at heart, and I think it's the thrill of the deal, and you just enjoy getting stuck in and growing. And we're very lucky to have you, obviously, and we're very appreciative of that. And I don't think retirement was suiting you just yet, was it? So getting involved in something is it's definitely always going to be something that you wanted to do. So, Bill, I want to get your take on how you feel regulation and compliance, essentially, and compliance training has evolved over the years. Obviously, you've been in the sector now for a very long time. You would have seen a huge amount of changes, I'm sure. What's that look like from your perspective?
Massive changes. You know, if you go back 25 years and compliance was in its infancy, compliance was regarded as, in fact, an area which precluded business. You know, the reality is, the attitude was, well, how do we just about satisfy the regulator and get away with it? So it was obviously a situation where it was a new discipline. It was being thrust upon the industries by regulators, allegedly, and the attitude was this was going to be bad for business. And therefore, but presumably we've got to do it. It was that negative attitude and approach that.
And did you think in the early days people saw it as a bit of a hindrance, and it was like we need to do it tick box type thing, get it done and dusted? And
exactly that. Yeah, exactly that.
And what do you think's changed since then?
Things have changed massively now. Compliance these days is regarded as a business enabler. That's the first thing. If you've got a strong compliance team, compliance people in the organization, a good chief compliance officer or head, they are an integral part of the firm. Compliance now is the responsibility of everybody in the organization. It starts at the top with the board, and the tone is set there and is driven down through the organization. So the attitude now is completely different. People in compliance are not sat in an ivory tower somewhere. They are an integrated part of the businesses. They sit in the different teams, often within the businesses themselves. Now, the reality is, of course, there are costs associated with having compliance teams and that. But the benefit side is you've got a good compliance team there. You avoid regulatory interference, and what I mean by that is, in fact, if you do things wrong, you don't get fined. You would get fined, but the reality is that if you've got a strong compliance team, you avoid the pitfalls. You don't make the mistakes. You don't engage in the culture or the situations that the regulators are going to be interfering with you. So the reality of the situation now is that the compliance teams stop you making mistakes. They see problems before they arise. They therefore stop you making mistakes, which can then be very costly, not just in terms of fines, but in terms of your reputation as a business. The fact that you may have to remedy the errors that you've made, and the legal costs can be astronomical in many of these cases. So with regulatory fine and the costs of getting things right, the reality about compliance is that if you get it wrong, it can be very, very expensive indeed. So the key thing is culture.
I was going to say, is it almost a culture
shift? It's all
here?
about the culture of it. It changed. In the early days, there wasn't that culture. It was thrust upon the organizations. The reality now is it is regarded as good business. Good compliance equals good business. And I know it's an old adage, but it's accurate and appropriate, because you can put systems, policies, procedures in place that preclude these things going wrong.
If it's not part of the DNA though of that business, it's great. But I think I think you're, from what I'm getting as well, there is that change is so big in terms of the culture and firms. Actually, it's everyone's role, isn't it? As you
Absolutely.
said there, that's the big change. Whereas before, someone might have said, "Oh, yeah, the compliance officer will deal with that. That's a compliance thing. That's not a HR thing, or that's not a retail thing." It's like, well, actually, no. Now businesses and compliance essentially has changed, where it's everyone's going, no, everyone, as you say there, everyone is responsible. It's from training staff who are working on a counter in a bank through to the MLRO or this compliance risk officer.
Absolutely right,
and everyone
John.
in between. And I think I think that rings bells with us as well, in terms of we're seeing that with our clients, whether we're with our one of our clients has got 2 staff through to 10,000. I think that culture and that change of compliance isn't just a back office thing anymore. It's not just a tick box exercise. It is part of the business, and it's making a massive impact. It's driving businesses forward. It's making them more credible. I think, and I'm sure you've seen that over
I think the other point I would make here, though, is the impact of culture and the difference that has had. What you're finding now is, particularly with the guidelines from regulators, they no longer adopt a very strict rules-based type of approach of principles. It's now very much more judgment-based. And what I mean by that is they will say, or require a compliance team to say, don't say, what can we do this? Will we get into trouble? The thing is, should we do this?
Yeah.
And you look at that aspect of
Ethical
it.
point
You
of
look
view.
at the ethics and the morality of situation. The growth, for example, in many organizations now are appointing ethics officers,
Yeah.
whose responsibility is to generate the culture within the organizations.
Yeah.
Particularly in the United States, there's lots and lots of people of that particular ilk that are in there. So it massive changes now.
Yeah, and obviously for the better. Clearly,
Oh,
for
got
the
to
better,
be.
isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely right. There's still, I don't know, in certain areas, there's still massive breaches and regulations, but the reality is, in fact, most organizations now are able to cater for the issues and try and avoid them.
And I think we're seeing it a lot, actually, with a lot of our clients will come to us and want sort of bespoke training, I suppose. But the training that they want, they almost want, I'd probably use it as almost like scenario based or practical sort of elements to it, where the skills that those individuals are learning within the firm, they're able to implement them in their day-to-day business and then see the impact it's having.
If you do a compliance qualification, you don't just do compliance.
Yeah.
It's a whole range of skills, because you have to be a good communicator, a good analyst. You need to understand regulations. You've got to deal with people. So it's a whole wide ranging. And as I say, the many people in compliance are in very senior positions now.
Yeah.
And particularly people who did compliance qualifications 25 years ago are often, chief compliance officers, heads of risk, reporting, or actually even sitting on boards in many instances these days.
Yeah, and they're having an active part, aren't they, within the business? And we're not just, it's a compliance role, compliance team, but that's they're impacting day to day as well.
Sure.
Through the impact they're having with the execs. Indeed. As well, and most of them are execs themselves. So indeed, it's big changes, and I think, like you say, it's obviously for the better. So Bill, I just want to touch on, obviously, compliance training. It's a big part of what we do, and whether that's a necessity or a nuisance. And I think we find, and we see it a lot, that regulations are always changing. It's almost like a bit of a minefield out there, isn't it? And it's obviously difficult for companies to keep on top of that on a regular basis. And I suppose when it comes to implementing training and compliance training into a firm, those constant changes probably lead to a few mistakes. So I suppose it's the question I want to ask is, what can companies do when implementing compliance training to avoid those mistakes?
I think the first thing is that the company's got to be committed and see the value of training. I think that once they've done that, you then get to the serious issue of, well, how do we deliver that? How can we make it effective? One of the key things that you've got to try and do is to make it competency based and skills based. It's not it's not good enough just to give people information. The type of training that people have to be given should be commensurate with the level that they are within the firm, but it's then got to be made innovative. It's got to be case study orientated. It's got to look at the type of competencies those people need within their job role. And as soon as you do that, then people see the value of it. And it's that key is the linkage there. So if we are coming to the conclusion that it's absolutely essential for these people to be trained because of the change in regulations, the volume of regulations, and for them to effectively do their job, they buy into that. Now, many companies, though, just won't spend the money. You know, that's one of the issues. So not only will some people won't spend it at all, others then won't spend it appropriately. And in fact, won't value it. They'll try and do the tick box approach, do as little as you can, do a few MCQ questions here and there, rather than actually doing proper competency-based training, and
that people can actually implement in their daily
that they
jobs.
can utilize in their job. And that's why I
good.
think more and more now we're going to be seeing technology being introduced into the training programs. It's quite difficult to do, but the reality is we are already starting to do that at what we do at Study Academy. And what we will then be able to do is people, because technology is a much more important component of compliance these days, and how you, for example, screen your customers, you know, as to who you're dealing with, what do you have to check when you're onboarding a customer and things of that nature. The reality is, if you can introduce them to technology, the make a terrific difference to them in their roles.
And I think that helps with, as you're saying there, you know, is not just a theory-based side, it's giving them practical skills that they can implement, because
Exactly
that then
right.
leads to measurable results.
It does.
You can actually see, okay, they're using skills that they've learned here within the business to ensure that it's more compliant. I don't know if you had the same experience. I found that a lot of mistakes that I've seen firms make is they almost see compliance training as it's a once a year thing. So they'll probably turn around and say, okay, look, everyone, it's November, let's get through all the compliance training, let's get it all boxed off. But compliance isn't static.
Absolutely.
It's constantly evolving, it's constantly moving. So almost that training needs to be sustained on a regular basis, you know, and I always say that you should have a firm, if you are using an external training provider, that is constantly horizon scanning, looking at what's changing and letting you know as an organization, not you going to them saying, oh, this new regulation's come into effect, can we have some training? That's why that once a year side of things of completing compliance training just doesn't work. I think that's a big mistake firms make. Don't just do it once a year. A regular, ongoing, consistent training
absolutely,
program
John.
is
Absolutely.
what works.
And I think the key thing is, what you've got to bear in mind is you've got to build into a company the culture of compliance and the culture of compliance training, and you start with the board. So inevitably, in a situation where a company is looking at training, you should be trying to address the board, because ultimately compliance is the responsibility of the board.
And then it filters down.
And it filters down, and it's got to be them that filter it down. They've then got to be able to provide the revenue and the resource to do the training, and then at different levels people have got to design the training that is appropriate for those people. And you're absolutely right, it can't be a one-off, it's a continuous thing. Regulations and fraud and things don't stop because you've just done your training. The reality is, in fact, it's got to be a continuous process. No question about that.
Because 1 minute you're okay, next minute the consumer duties come into effect, next minute the worker protection acts come into effect. These things are constantly evolving. New things are happening, and I think that's, for me, from my experience, is definitely a big mistake that firms are making. It's, you know, keep it consistent, keep that training flowing, and it's just sustained constantly.
But also, you can't teach skills on a one-off basis. You know, you can't teach competency on or off. It has to be a continuous process. And that's why what you're suggesting there is absolutely the right approach. It has to be all the year round, and it has to be company-wide, driven down by the board.
And I think it's a bit similar to what we've been doing recently, where You'll visit boards, talk to our client board members on a regular sort of basis throughout the year, updating them on compliance. But then we have clients that will drip feed courses to, one a month, two a month. And then if anything changes, we'll put something really short and punchy together that really updates them on that bit of compliance. And I think, anyone out there that's listening, especially from a firm, is if you are embedding training in your organization, then do it so it's a constant drip feed, not just that one-off tick box.
Absolutely right.
Let's try and get it all done in one go.
Couldn't agree more.
And I think that naturally just leads us on to the next part of, how can a business turn compliance into a strategic advantage for their business?
I think the first thing you've got to look at here is to say that compliance is a business enabler, right? So we've suggested that is the case because if you have a good, strong compliance team, you, in fact, see problems coming, you avoid regulatory interference, you gain a much better reputation. And as a consequence of that, then it has become a business enabler. And as we've said on many occasions, good compliance is good business. I think that's the key there.
And I think it's almost seeing it as, it's not a burden, it's an opportunity, because a lot of people, I think, see it as like compliance is a burden to what we do. We have to do X, Y, and Z to make sure we're compliant. But if you see it as an opportunity, then it just gives you further opportunity for growth there. I think it's almost like a badge of credibility, isn't it? You've got good compliance as a business, then it's that credibility of like, you're doing things well.
Do you know what? Some really enlightened organizations make, how you perform as a compliance unit as a criteria for promotions and bonuses. It's indicated in relation to that. Now, I know we talk about the return on investment, but you get it right, and it's a massive generator of business. The enhancement of reputation, seeing the problems coming along, amending any changes that need to do before they develop into problems is, a really important aspect of the value of compliance.
Yeah, like you say, if it's embedded in that DNA, it flows naturally anyway within that organisation. So
Absolutely.
I think it's obviously a perfect fit from that side of things.
The point I would make also is that compliance is the sixth sense of the organisation. In the sense that because it sees the problems, it resolves them before they become difficult. It helps and enhances the organisation on a financial basis because of that. You're not employing volumes of lawyers to defend you in cases and all of the things that go with that. And that, therefore, is a critical component. And I keep going back to that, though. If you've got a strong compliance unit, you are highly likely to have a successful organisation.
And I think that needs to also cross-pollinate across the compliance team. So it's not, you haven't just got a compliance risk officer.
No.
You've got IT compliance, you've got data compliance, you've got all these different areas of compliance that all work in harmony together. Legal compliance,
Absolutely.
it's a unit, isn't it? I suppose that cross-pollinates across
compliance
the business.
is complying with regulations and the appropriate policies, procedures. Applies to every aspect of the organisation. And it's not only in certain industry. Every industry will have rules and regulations that it has to comply with. And so it applies to it. It's as wide as that.
How do you see the future of compliance training? Your experience with the ICA, and obviously you would have seen a lot of change over those years to where we are now with technology and things. But where do you think it's going in the world of compliance training?
That's a really interesting question. Top of the list has got to be the impact of technology on the way that jobs are being performed. I've indicated, I think previously, when if you're talking about screening of clients and and onboarding, the technology solutions that are now available in relation to that, the advent of AI, ChatGPT, it's going to change the face of how we train. We've got to make the training much more innovative. It's got to be much more analytical because the content is always there and everybody can access the content. It's then how you use that.
Yeah.
And it's being much more creative in the way that we develop the training programs and the assessment procedures. You know, I think the reality is that with the advent of AI, we're going to have to reformat how we assess things, perhaps project-based programs, you know, relating to the particular issues within a company, rather than, you know, standard methodologies of training. You know, you may even have to bring back the, you know, proper formal classroom assessments where people are being watched, so that, you know, they're not using their basically their technology to find out the answers to various questions and things. So there's going to be lots of changes, I think, in the way that training takes place. It will be more analytical, it will be more innovative, it will be more technology focused within the training programs themselves, and it's got to be much more competency based. There's no question about that.
And I suppose it's training on technology, isn't it? Like you say,
well, that's the key.
You know, KYC screening, all that sort of stuff. It's sort of like
it's
gone
really
are the days of
that.
Manually doing that.
You can't now just give somebody, you know, and say, you know, here's an article, just read the article. It doesn't work like that now.
And I think, you know, people watching this might be a mixed bag of people saying, oh, you know, AI is fantastic, others going, oh, it's really scary. And I think where I see the future of training going is there will be a lot of software that will be beneficial, and then it's teaching people to use it. But even things like, you know, utilizing AI to identify gaps in learning for individuals, or, you know, a firm, for example, could upload a whole bunch of their policies, and AI would automatically then generate courses specifically around their policies and procedures.
But you've got to have people who can then look at that and see the gaps and ensure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So what you've got to say, what are the learning outcomes we need from this training, and how therefore do we get there, utilizing every tool that we've got, including technology.
It's like an enabler, isn't it? It's enabling people to learn
what we've said.
more, and then it's also, I think it's a combination of, you know, human interaction with technology, with sort of the academia side, and bringing all that together to essentially make what's really good compliance training. I think that's where the future of it will essentially go. Obviously, compliance training is critical, it's very important, but how do you balance that, and how did you do this at the ICA with other forms of development or training? Obviously there's other needs, so how do you do that, Bill?
I think the way you approach that is, if you employ a member of staff, or you do an evaluation on a member of staff, you do a gap analysis. What you do is what we call a training needs analysis. So you evaluate, you look at the reports from that individual, you see where their skills lie and where their weaknesses lie. And then in relation to that, having done the gap analysis, if in fact the area then, you know, that you feel is weak is that they have very little knowledge of regulatory requirements, how, you know, the very nature of compliance, what is ethics, and all the key areas. And if you've then evaluated that and say, well, they've got skills in certain areas but not others, but you do that to every aspect of the role that they have, and say, right, well, where should the priorities lie here? Where are their weaknesses in the main? And then you would focus the training on the areas of weakness. Now, it might be the compliance area, but equally it might not be. So what you've got to do is look at the individual in the round, evaluate their skills and their weaknesses, and then focus and do the training to try and bring, you know, to eradicate the weaknesses. And I think that's the key way of balancing, in fact, the type of training that somebody needs, based upon, in fact, you know, the range of things that you've looked at.
And I think it's interesting. We had a client in a similar situation actually as this. They had a fantastic compliance team essentially, and they were bringing in a new wave of staff within that team. So a lot of people actually stepping up into a leadership role. So then it came, right, okay, we know these guys and girls are very good at compliance, but now actually, are they ready to be leaders and step into a leadership sort of capacity? And that's where then,
and I think that's the point,
like leadership management training.
If you've got somebody who wants to progress, say from a role within compliance to a chief compliance officer, you've got to evaluate what are the skills needed in this particular role?
Yeah.
What are the competencies? And you map them against that. You'll see where the weakness is. And I think that's a good approach, whether you're talking about compliance or not.
Yeah.
You take all of
industry.
your employees, what skills does this person need within this job? If they're going to be promoted, what additional skills would they need? How do we fill that
What's
gap?
that career pathway essentially look like? I'm here.
Yeah.
I want to be there. What do I need to get
Exactly
there?
right.
And I suppose it's looking at, what there's different competencies and skill sets here than there is here.
Yeah.
And I need to obviously ensure that I develop.
Absolutely.
And I think that's good. I think that's where having a diverse training plan essentially within a business that isn't solely just compliance, it's making sure
Agreed.
that it's a broad spectrum of different soft skills and leadership and other things as well are a great fit for any firm, not just in regulated sort of industries as well.
Yeah.
So your time at the ICA, obviously a large pool of staff there, and I'm sure employee development obviously within a training organisation was quite key. Was there any key areas or key developments with that employee sort of development side of things that help the business scale? Any training or employee development that you think really benefited the growth of the business?
When I was at the ICA and when I was also the MD of CLT International, which was a training organisation for wealth managers, I think I had it within 20 years about 12 interns, usually one a year, who would come in, and in fact they would be doing work experience and so on. Of those 12 interns that we had taken on, the first thing I insisted that they did is, again, having done an initial gap analysis on their skill sets, I insisted that they take the ICA qualifications as they
understood essentially what they were
exactly right.
What the business was
so
sort of
they now, in terms of that in itself is fine. But what was interesting, because we tracked the careers of all of those individuals, many of which remained with the ICA, but of those 12 individuals, 8 of them went on to senior positions, both either within the ICA or in other organizations outside. So the fact that, we developed their skills at a young age, while they were learning, giving them that core element in compliance and taking certifications and training at that point, obviously bore fruit for them, because, as I say, 3/4 of them, were in senior positions within the compliance industry.
But isn't that? I find that fascinating that it's and I think. How long ago was that? Sorry, was it in the early stages of the ICA?
Throughout the whole of the period.
Yeah. So you're looking like from 20-25 years ago until now. That what I find really fascinating about it is investment in entry level. You would, a lot of people would think we need to invest in senior managers, which is you do, of course. You do. But actually, the impact of investing in your frontline staff.
Give you without naming any names here. There was a young lady that joined me from university that I knew, and she started as my PA. And then 15 years later, she was the director of sales and marketing.
Yeah, it just shows, doesn't it? It's that impact of early investment in that team,
early training, taking it on, learning the skills and developing and building.
Yeah.
So that's a classic example, is if they're nurtured, if they're trained in the appropriate way, you give them the opportunities, then your staff can grow. And if they've got to have the competencies to do that,
Yeah.
So
I always think about, so we have Eleanor, who's our e-learning content coordinator, obviously here at Study Academy. Eleanor was a former teacher, as you know, Bill. And the great thing I find is she understands learning styles. She understands that side of things. And as a training company, that's fantastic. But when she joined us, the software that she was using, she had a sort of a basic understanding of, and she was a little bit concerned. I'm sure she won't mind me saying that the only thing I'm worried about here is I've not used this technology before. But she just dived straight in. We obviously funded the course, the training for her, and she completed it, and now she's just off and running, and she's teaching me things. I know the software quite well, and daily she'll go, "Oh, John, have a look at this," and it's just, I think it's a key thing.
There's a massive change, John, in and I'm going back to early days where if you were training as a lawyer, you're often thrown in at the deep end.
Yeah, yeah.
No proper training. I mean, yes, you do your paper qualifications, but the reality, you often throw people in and they either sink or swim. That's
Yeah.
not the way to train people in the best way.
No.
You give them the tools, you give them the opportunities, they take the training, they learn it, and then they can utilize
And
it.
apply it. That's the
Yeah.
thing, is it's applying it.
We are much better these days. In
Yeah.
fact, with the skills and competency-based training that we try and adopt with staff than used to be the case many, many years ago.
And I think that's worked for us as if we look at the clients that we have and the impact that we have. Just this morning we were talking to HomeServe, who are a regulated business, obviously in the insurance sector. But we were talking about in the last few years, I mean, we've qualified about 3,500 of their staff now in compliance qualifications. But if we look solely at leadership and management apprenticeships that we delivered for them, I think I had 99 managers go through. And they said to us they believe 96 of those have got distinctions in there, and just how that's impacted the business.
Yeah, going
you know,
forward,
and they invested in those sort of mid-tier or mid-level managers that have now all worked their way up, and then the skills that they've learned has fed down again back into the organisation. And I think it's almost like I felt like a proud father, to be fair, but it's like, you see the impact you're having as an organisation, and just how investing in individuals. And I think that's how it's changing. The companies want to invest in their staff. Again, they don't see it as something we must do. It's something we want to do. It's part of their culture, as part of their DNA now, which is just fantastic to see. And I know I mentioned HomeServe there, but I think that leads me on to our next question around sort of businesses really measuring the effectiveness of their compliance training. And I think there are obviously various different metrics that businesses can look at to see whether it's measurable, it's having an impact. But what do you think are some of those metrics that businesses essentially can measure to see if their compliance training is being effective?
It's always difficult when you're looking at return on investment, for example, in building a compliance team, of which training is an important component. You've got to then say, well, what are the cost implications? First of all, you've got salaries of the team, you've got technology that you've got to put in place, the cost of the training itself. So there are, a lot of costs that you've got to take into account, and saying, well, for us to be compliant, there are significant expenses that have to be paid in relation to that. But then you say, well, how do you balance that out? Now, if you do a good job, the reality is, and I think we've mentioned before, one of the biggest problems is if you don't get it right, there's regulatory sanction, that has to be taken into account. How do you take into account, if you've got a fine of 63 million, for example, one bank, it's easy to go and check these things. 102 million found, another 400 million fine. I think I'd said to you earlier that, in 2022, there was over 5 billion regulatory fines. Now, that's just one aspect of it, but it's not just the stick to beat people with. You will get fined if you do wrong. That's one aspect of it. You've then got to say, well, if we've trained these people properly, are there going to be less regulatory breaches that we're not going to that we will pick up? If therefore these people are properly trained, they'll see the problems, they can amend those problems, and then if you've got a problem, you get the massive increased costs then, particularly if you get lawsuits and legal expenses, which can, on the one hand, be massive. So that's got to be balanced out against it.
And they're not being reactive then, are they? It's
not
proactive.
Not at all. They're being proactive.
Yeah.
You avoid it. You then say, well, we get more business because we've got a great reputation. We're not in the headlines all the time because of complaints. So how do you then balance that? How do you judge how much new business is on the back of the reputation of the organisation? So there are checks and balances that you have to do. It's not an exact science, but I think if you're a well-run organisation that is not in the headlines for negative reasons all the time, whose business is growing, a lot of that will be down to the way the organisation is managed and it is effective. And I think the compliance team and how it deals with the issues is a significant part of that.
And I suppose everyone's different, aren't they? I suppose each firm will have their own measurements on impact and how and some will be say, well, if we have, we have no fines, a bit like a a health and safety firm might say, we've had no accidents this year and stuff.
Yeah.
But then others would be saying, well, actually, we've had an increase in staff productivity, because I suppose everyone's different in how they measure the impact of training. Essentially, I think we had a client that actually their staff, after training, their staff are raising internally more almost like compliance red flags, essentially, which just meant that they were, because the staff were more confident in doing so, because they'd had the training on how to raise them, who to raise them to, how to identify them as well, which was great, which then obviously resulted in better audit outcomes and less compliance issues long term because of that training. I think it's times like that where sometimes the measurement of the impact of training might not be that clear, but when you sit back and look at it with a wider lens and say, well, actually, we've had more people reporting stuff here, and we've had less of this. We've had more of this. I suppose everyone's different, every firm's different, and I think that's really interesting as well. It's great the points that you put across, Bill, and I think that measuring of that impact will come down to each business, but it's looking for it. Sometimes it'll slap you in the face, but other times it might be very, very subtle, but has a massive impact overall. So some fantastic knowledge there, Bill, and I think I want to end this really with giving those people that are listening a bit of a nugget, a sort of golden nugget really of information that they can take away and implement now. So I think it's almost looking at what can individuals and firms be doing now to almost future-proof their compliance within their organisation. Anything that you think that they could be doing?
Key thing for me is that organisations should have as an objective the building of a compliance culture.
Yeah.
And as I've indicated, I think previously, that starts from the top. You get the tone from the top, and that infiltrates all the way down through the business. So one of the hardest things, though, is how do you change culture in an organisation? The best way of doing it is by way of training. Training is starting with the board, getting them to buy into the concept, which can then be fed down, and through the training you can change the culture of an organization away from how do we get round the regulations to should we actually be doing that. So culture and ethics are really important concepts in terms of what you should be trying to develop going forward. Now, having said that, risk is very important and is growing, the number of risks that organizations face. So firms should be having a really strong risk framework. And what I mean by that is that the role of compliance is to identify the risks to an organization. It's not just compliance, but the whole series of risks that you've got. You then got to identify, you've got to then quantify that risk, and see, well, how big a danger is it? How do you then mitigate that? What measures shall be taken to mitigate the risk? And then how do you monitor it? Now, if you can put a strong risk framework in place, and you teach risk and how you analyze and identify that using case studies and all the different methodology you can do. If you've got tone from the top driving down and a strong risk framework that people can focus on, you can then also, in addition to that, take the use of technology. Now, technology is, it's facial recognition. Screening of your clients. You can have what they call KYC hubs now, where a number of organizations will get together and say, well, we've done our CDD on this person. Do you want to see a copy of that? And they all contribute. So there are lots and lots of ways where you can build cooperation and culture and tone from the top. And that combination of things then are going to help, I think, significantly going forward, particularly if you can utilize the technology in the way we've suggested.
And do you feel it's almost not being too laser focused on one part? It's almost saying, look, you need to focus on everything here. yes, training's a key part, but let's talk about policies, procedures, like you say, technology, all these different elements, and making sure that you've almost got like a bit of an oversight and of all
But
parts
that's
of it,
what
really.
compliance does.
Yeah,
It has that oversight. It has to look at all of those areas. It's no good having one area of the organisation that's compliant. It's got to be the whole organisation. And part of their role is that oversight, that analysis, that help. In the old days, compliance used to sit in the corner or in a separate part of the building.
Yeah.
Now they sit in the teams
Yeah.
within an organisation, and that's got to be the way forward. And if we develop in that way, we'll have a lot more stronger businesses.
And I think what you said, Bill, fits nicely with, I just feel like something that everyone can probably take away is building, when we talk about building that team, is a compliance team that not only understands regulations now and the current regulations, but is able to anticipate future trends and future changes in regulation. And that does come from learning. You know, it's tailoring in that learning so that they are aware of what's coming up, or having a provider essentially that does that hard work for them, and acts as almost an extension of their compliance team, of their arm. And then ultimately not looking at it as a back office function. It's across the business function. Essentially, everyone should be involved.
I think that's changing, John. I think compliance is at the forefront
Yeah,
in many
yeah.
organisations, not in all.
No,
and
yeah,
that's why. But in those organisations that you would say would be well-run organisations, compliance is at the forefront. It is actually in every aspect and every area of the organisation, you know, in a good way.
Yeah.
Their advisors, their helpers, their support. They see the problems, they analyse the problems, they solve them before they come along. So if you've got a strong chief compliance officer and a strong compliance team, it's worth gold
It's like
to
a
the
shield, isn't
organisation.
it? A shield for the business.
Absolutely,
They're
yeah.
protecting it on
Indeed.
constantly.
Absolutely, John.
Bill, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much for
pleasure.
your time. And yeah, I'm sure we'll catch up again soon.
Absolutely.